All right, Joe, say good morning. Let us begin by thanking our sponsor, our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul, Avram and Shane D. Kelman, for dedicating all the Shurim and Drushos this month in memory of their parents, Zechron Bracha. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an Aliyah and the family a Nechama. We thank all of our Week of Learning sponsors, Alan Wiseman, for dedicating the Shurim this week in commemoration of the 10th yahrzeit of his beloved wife, Rita, Rivka Rachel Bas Zechariah, Jesse and Rivka Meiravitz, in honor of the birth of a baby boy, to Shmuel and Shira Artman, Dr. Ron and Marlene Gartenhouse, in honor of their sons Harris and Simon, learning in Eretz Yisrael, Paul and Kathy Pollack, as a zechus for Refuah Shalema for Alter Ben Golda Etcha. And our Daf Yomi sponsors for today, the Plunka family, in commemoration of the yahrzeits of Elazar ben Shimon, the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, and Sajah ben Yosef, or Sajah Gon, whose yahrzeits are being observed today. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshamas will have an Aliyah, and they should be a schus for all of Klal Yisrael. But so with that, let us begin. Shechianu, Vikimanu, Vigianu, Lazman Hazeh, to come to Maseches Beah, an incredibly exciting Masechta filled with incredible halacha, incredible agadata. For those who were learning Smichas Chaver, there will also be a very nice chazara of much of Hilchos Muktzah, which we will see, which will be very, very nice. Even those who didn't learn Smichas Chaver will have a nice chazara of Hilchos Muktzah. And I will say with that, let us begin. Says the Mishnah, Beitzah Shenol da B'yamtiv. Right, Beitzah Shenol. I think everyone in their life has come across this Mishnah in some way, shape, or form at some time. For some of us, maybe in yeshiva, those of us who learn the Daf, certainly in Daf Yomi, but again, a very famous Mishnah. Beitzah Shenol da B'yamtiv. Literally, again, a chicken lays an egg on Yamtiv. What is the status of the egg? So says the Gemara, Beis Shammai omrim tochal. Beis Shammai says you are permitted to go ahead and eat the egg. Ubeis Hillel omrim lo sochal. Beis Hillel says you are not permitted to eat the egg. So both say, what is at the core of that machlokes? Emir Hashem will be seen in the Gemara. So that's machlokes number one. Machlokes number two in the Mishnah. Beis Shammai omrim sa'ar bekizayis chametz bekikoseves. Both the second machlokes is regarding the shear of sa'ar. See, it's interesting. We often translate sa'ar as chametz. Sa'ar is actually a leavening agent, right? So sa'ar is something that could be sourdough, a leavening agent, or something you introduce into a mixture in order to create chimutz, in order to create the leavening process. So what's the shear on Pesach, the prohibitive shear for sa'ar? So Beis Shammai omrim sa'ar bekizayis, the shear of sa'ar is a kizayis, and the chametz, but chametz itself is bekikoseves, is the size ultimately again of a date. Now again, just to orient you a little bit, so like in the world of shiurim, going from least to greatest, you'll have a kizayis, a koseves, and a kebeitzah. So again, so you have Beis Shammai saying the shear for sa'ar is going to be. By the way, there are Beah notebooks over here if anyone wants, right behind Saeed. Also extra ones up here. The notebooks are yours. Compliments of the shear. Again, I think many of the Chavras started doing this already back in Sukkah. Some even started a little bit before it. It's kedai to keep a notebook, to write down whether it's halachas or hashkafas or ideas, chidushim you have, epiphanies you have, thoughts you have, ideas that grab your attention. Also a wonderful way to retain something from the daf, because we move so quickly. That sometimes it's kedai just to go ahead and retain a nugget, a morsel for each and every daf. In any event, so we have second machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is the machlokes in the shear of sa'ar. So you have again Beis Shammai saying sa'ar is kizayis, chametz is kikoseves. Chametz is kikoseves. Beis Hillel say zev kizayis. Beis Hillel say the shear for both sa'ar as well as chametz is going to be kizayis. We'll say that's machlokes number two. Now, by the way, what do these two machlokesim have in common with each other? So the answer is very little, except for one important fact. If you look at Rashi divrei hamaschil sa'ar bekizayis mishum dahani tlas mili have mikulei Beis Shammai or mechumrei Beis Hillel. The common denominator amongst the three machlokesim mentioned here in the Mishnah are unique circumstances where Beis Shammai is Mekel, and Beis Hillel is Machmir, which of course is not the norm. Normally we're used to seeing the opposite. The unique quality of the three Machloksim over here is Beis Hillel is Machmir and Beis Shammai is Mekel. So again, chicken lays an egg on Yom Tiv, Beis Shammai says eat it. Beis Hillel says no, you can't. Why? We'll have to see. Machlokis number 2, the shear of Sa'ar, Beis Shammai says, is a Kizayis. Chametz, Koseves, and ultimately again Beis Hillel, both Bekizayis. Good. Hashochet Chayiv Oaf B'Yom Tiv. Next. What if one goes out and shechts a Chaya or an Oaf on Yom Tiv? Remember again, a Chaya, non-domesticated animal. Oaf is a bird. The common denominator between those two animals is you require Kisui Hadam. Kisui Hadam is a mitzvah to cover the blood of the animal after Shechita. But Kisui Hadam does not apply to what we'll call domestic animals. So for example, you shecht the cow, you shecht the sheep, there is no mitzvah of Kisui Hadam. It is only Dafka Chaya and Oaf. So what happens if you go ahead and you shecht a Chaya and an Oaf on Yom Tiv? Remember again, you're allowed to shecht a Chaya and Oaf on Yom Tiv? You're allowed to? Yes. Why? Ochel Nefesh. Ochel Nefesh. Remember again, Torah tells us that any malacha that you need to do for the sake of normative food preparation is permitted on Yom Tiv. So you go ahead and you shech the chayin off b'Yom Tiv. Then I will say, now remember, everyone would agree that what's the ideal? The ideal is that before Yom Tiv, you have dirt prepared for kisui hadam. Now we'll discuss why that's a necessity. But lamaisa again, what happens if you did it and you didn't have dirt prepared? Beis Shammai omrim yachpor bedeker v'yichasa. Beis Shammai says no problem, just dig dirt. Literally yachpor bedeker means dig with a shovel, right? Obtain dirt and perform the mitzvah of kisei hadam. Beis Hillel says, Beis Hillel omrim lo yishchot ela im kein hayalo afar muchan mi ba'od yom. Interesting. So Beis Hillel says, halacha l'maisa, no, you cannot shecht unless what? Unless you had dirt prepared for b'mnami ba'od yom means from before Yom Tiv. From before Yom Tiv. Good. Umod is supposed to say, here's another machlokis, right? We have Beis Shammai saying that halacha l'maisa, no problem to go ahead and prepare the dirt on Yom Tiv itself. Beis Hillel saying the dirt must be prepared before Yom Tiv. Umodim, and they will agree, shim shachat. So we'll say the way this sounds like, although again we're going to qualify this in the Gemara. Umodim, Beis Hillel will agree to Beis Shammai shim shachat, that if you did shecht. So remember again, what's Beis Hillel's shita? Beis Hillel says really the only way you should shecht on Yom Tiv is when, or is how? If you have dirt prepared. Now again, remember, we have to fill in the whole sentence. The only way you should shecht a chaya and an oaf on Yom Tiv is if you have your dirt prepared from before Yom Tiv, right? So what happens if you shechted? Umodim. Beis Hillel will agree that if you did shecht, umodim shim shachat, sheyachbar badeker v'yichasa, that you should go ahead and dig with a shovel, obtain dirt, and cover the blood. She'efer kira muchanhu, because the soot or the dirt of the stove is considered to be prepared. I will say, now what that statement means, because it doesn't exactly seem to flow, we will have to see inside of the Gemara. Good. So we'll say these are our three machloksim, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, situations in which Beis Shammai is Mekel, Beis Hillel is Machmir. We are going to spend the remainder of the daf focusing on the first of these three machloksim, namely Beitzah shenolda b'Yom Tiv. Chicken lays an egg on Yom Tiv. Are you permitted to eat the egg or not? Beis Hillel says no. Beis Shammai says yes. What is at the root of that machlokes? Watch this. B'maya skinon, says the Gemara, what's the case? What's the case? Maya skinon. Ilema b'tarnagoles ha'omedes la'achila. If you so we'll say, when we say what's the case, the first question we're asking is, what kind of chicken? Right? There are different kinds of chicken. There are chickens that you have set aside for laying eggs, and there are chickens that you have for consumption. So what kind of chicken are we talking about? So the Gemara says, so if you want to say that it's a chicken that's designated for consumption, then what? Why would Beis Hillel say that if the chicken lays an egg, that ultimately what? It should be asur. So I will say, what's the question over here? If the chicken itself is kulo designated la'achila, right? I'm going to eat the chicken. That means, am I allowed to eat the chicken on Yom Tiv? Yeah. So that means what? Any part of the chicken is what? It's food. In fact, that's what it means. Uchla de ifrasu. If the chicken is designated as food, then any part of the chicken is designated as food as well. So if it lays an egg, the egg should be permitted. Uchla de ufrasu means it's just food that has separated from its source. But essentially, if it's designated as achila, it all has the halachic designation of food, and therefore should all be permitted. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, uchla de ifras, ochel shenifrad, v'chevera b'menachos, chaburi ochlin kemad de mifrisi damu. So again, if the chicken is designated for consumption and it lays an egg, the egg should absolutely be permitted for consumption as well. Uchla de ifrasu is just food that's been separated from its source, and therefore should be mutter. So it says the Gemara, Ella, therefore we must say, B'tarnagoles ha'omedes lagadol beitzim, that this is an egg-laying chicken, right? That you have a chicken designated, I'm not eating this chicken. Instead, what am I doing? This chicken is set aside to lay eggs. Okay, so let's analyze this. If the chicken is set aside to lay eggs, my taimahu de Beis Shammai, then halacha l'maisa, why would Beis Shammai allow you to eat the egg? After all, muktzahu. Isn't the egg muktzah? Now let's talk about this a little bit. So we're going to see exactly, the Gemara presupposes that we know about the concept of muktzah and we understand its use. As we're going to see, the truth is, we already saw a good part of this in Masechah Shabbos with the Machlokes Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, which really centers on the parameters of muktzah, which we're actually going to get into today. So what the Gemara is asking is as follows: Beis Shammai, if we assume that we're dealing over here with a chicken that's there to lay eggs, okay? And now the chicken lays the egg on Yom Tiv. How could Beis Shammai permit the egg? After all, the egg should be muktzah. Now, what's the Gemara's logic in saying the egg should be muktzah? Because the egg wasn't here on Erev Yom Tiv. If it wasn't here on Erev Yom Tiv, then what? Then it has not been actively set aside for use. If it hasn't been set aside for use, then shouldn't it be muktzah? That's the question of the Gemara. The Gemara says, Umay kusha, I don't understand why that's such a question. Dilma, Beis Shammai lesle muktzah. Maybe, before you get excited about this statement, there's someone who doesn't hold the muktzah. I've been waiting for this my whole life. No, I'll say, so again, when it says Beis Shammai lesle muktzah, what it means is Beis Shammai does not subscribe to what we'll call a strict or narrow definition of muktzah. So what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. Lesle muktzah. Rashi, what does it mean when we say Beis Shammai doesn't hold like muktzah? Dilma k'Rabbi Shimon svirle. I will say, remember, we have a machlokes in the Gemara, which we'll make reference to today, between Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, about, do we have, for lack of better terms, we'll call it a narrow definition of muktzah or an expansive definition of muktzah. Now, how exactly does this play out? So look at Rashi. Last thing, muktzah, the Dilma Rabbi Shimon sirle, maybe Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Shimon, the Amr beperek kira, Moser Hashem and Shebener v'Shebekara, Aser Rabbi Shimon Matir. So we'll say, listen to this case. This is actually great. You have a ner. Now remember again, in halacha, in Gemara, what does a ner mean? A little chazara from our Eruvin. And what does a ner mean? Right? It's a receptacle. Right? So remember again, what you have over here essentially is, it could be an open bowl with a little lip in which you put the wick. You would fill the receptacle, you would fill the bowl with oil. Watch this. You light a ner before Shabbos. This is so exciting. You right? It's like that new Gemara. I would say that new Gemara smell, but it's that new Gemara feel. Like there's like, you start a Masechta, you feel like the world is your kosher oyster, right? Mamish, you could do anything. You could be anything. This could be my Masechta, right? This could be the opportunity to be kona something. It's so exciting. So we'll say, so remember the following case. You light your ner. And now what happens? You have a bowl filled with oil, and the wick goes out. So now you have leftover oil inside of that receptacle. Figure leftover oil, great, I'm going to make a salad dressing. Fantastic, right? I'm going to go ahead and use the oil. Are you allowed to use that's called the Mosar Shemen Shebener? the leftover oil inside of the receptacle. Are you allowed to use that or not? We're going to see Rabbi Yehuda says no. Because since the oil became muktzah at the onset of Shabbos, right? Remember Smichas Chaver. Migo di iskatsoi leben hashmashos, right? Once you are designated as muktzah, we saw this in Daf Yomi also. Once you're designated as muktzah at the beginning of Shabbos, then what? That status remains. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says no. No, the oil was only muktzah when? Only muktzah when? When the nair was burning. Because you must remember again, you can't tamper with the oil when the nair is burning, because then you can get into issues of havara or kiboy, of kindling or of extinguishing. But once the nair goes out and the oil is just sitting there, the oil is absolutely permitted. So when so the Gemara is suggesting over here as well. So we'll say that's machlokes Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Shimon. So it's interesting that the way the Gemara kind of titles that machlokes is that Rabbi Shimon lesle muktzah, Rabbi Yehuda isle muktzah, which translates as Rabbi Shimon doesn't hold of muktzah, Rabbi Yehuda, which of course is not true. Everyone holds of muktzah. Everyone holds of muktzah. The shaila just is how narrow or how wide is your definition. So again, essentially, Rabbi Yehuda holds once you're muktzah, always muktzah. Although there are exceptions to that rule as well, even according to Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says no, even if you start out Shabbos muktzah, if something changes, your muktzah status has the ability to change as well. So let's say, now watch this. So let's follow the progression over here. So first of all, the Gemara says, let's shift gears. We're talking about a chicken that is designated to lay eggs. Okay, if that's the case, then ultimately, again, why does Beis Shammai allow it? It's muktzah, to which the Gemara says, Umay kushya, Dilma Beis Shammai lesle muktzah. Maybe Beis Shammai doesn't hold of muktzah. In other words, maybe Beis Shammai has a more expansive or looser definition of muktzah, and therefore would allow the use of the egg. So the Gemara says, 1 second. Umay kushya Dilma Beis Shammai lesle muktzah. Kasaka daitin, afilu man deshay b'muktzah binolad aser. Here's the problem we'll say. The Gemara says we're dealing with two different things over here. There's muktzah, which are the general categories of muktzah, and then there's a specific category called nolad. Now again, we're being introduced to this over here. What's nolad? What's nolad? Kishmo kenhu, something that did not exist prior to Yom Tiv, or Shabbos for that matter. Right now we're talking about Yom Tiv, right? Prior to Yom Tiv, and now comes into existence on Yom Tiv. What the Gemara wants to suggest is that nolad is a stricter category of muktzah, to the point that even if you hold like Rabbi Shimon by Gans muktzah, right, by the rest of the halachos of muktzah, and take a more permissive view by muktzah, everyone agrees that nolad is a stricter category. And if nolad is indeed a stricter category, my tamay of the Beis Shammai. Ultimately, again, how could Beis Shammai allow for the consumption of the egg on Yom Tov? So I will say, just follow the progression over here, right? Remember, we're trying to figure out one simple question. I'll say, isn't this incredible, right? A group of grown men sitting here at 5:57 in the morning, trying to figure out what kind of chicken are we talking about, right? What kind of chicken? I will say, what kind of chicken makes all the difference in the world? So remember again, if it's a chicken, if it's we'll call it a consumption chicken, then I don't understand the position of Beis Hillel. The egg should be permitted. It's all food, right? So it must be a chicken that is set aside to go ahead and what? Lay eggs, all right? If it's set aside to lay eggs, I don't understand. Shouldn't it be muktzah? Shouldn't the egg be muktzah? If the egg is muktzah, then how does Beis Shammai allow you to eat it? To which the Gemara says, maybe Beis Shammai doesn't hold of muktzah, i.e., subscribe to the position of Rabbi Shimon, the more expansive view. To which the Gemara says that can't be. Because even if you hold of a more permissive view of muktzah, like Rabbi Shimon, everyone agrees that what is aser? What is aser? Nolad. Nolad. And this is a case of, now I will say, where the Gemara gets these kind of like presuppositions from, right? We'll have to see, right? Because the Gemara is stating things as fact that we don't know to be fact. In other words, that even if you're mako by muktzah, like Rabbi Shimon, that you're machmer by nolad, okay, how do you know? Well, so remember, we're making assertions, now we'll back them up afterwards. So the Gemara says, I still don't understand how Beis Shammai could allow for the consumption of the egg. After all, it's nolad. So here we go. Amr Rav Nachman. So we'll say we're now going to go through a series of different opinions as to what the machlok is. Amr Rav Nachman. Liolam b'tarna goles ha'omedes lagadol beitzim. So Rav Nachman is taking us back. You're right. let's go back to the drawing board, right? It's like what we said before. We're talking about a chicken that is meant to lay eggs, okay? But again, we're stuck then. What are we stuck with? If it's a chicken that's meant to lay eggs, I understand the position of Beis Hillel, who says the egg is asur. Who don't I understand? Beis Shammai. How could Beis Shammai say that the egg is mutter? Because after all, it's no lod. Watch this. V'di isle muktzah isle no lod. V'di lesle muktzah lesle no lod. Ultimately, again, says the Gemara, so Rav Nachman says, you made an assertion that was incorrect. You assumed that even if you adopt a more lenient view of muktzah, i.e. Rabbi Shimon, you hold a strict view of no lod. And Rav Nachman says, that's not true. No lod is part of which framework? Part of which framework in halacha? Muktzah. No lod isn't its own halachic entity, its own halachic misgeret framework. No lod is part of muktzah. So whatever you hold by the rest of muktzah, you hold by no lod also. So if you take a stricter view by muktzah, you take a stricter view of no lod. If you take a more lenient view of muktzah, you take a more lenient view of no lod. And Beis Shammai k'Rabbi Shimon, uBeis Hillel k'Rabbi Yehuda. And Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Shimon, right? Which again, Rabbi Shimon, it takes, and we'll call it a more relaxed view of muktzah, and Beis Hillel holds like Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, Beis Shammai will be mekel in no lod as well, and therefore allow for the consumption of the egg. Good. So take a look. Take a look at. Good. Fine. So good. Let's go right there. Did Rav Nachman actually say this? So did Rav Nachman actually say that Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Shimon? V'hotinan, we learned, interesting case, Beis Shammai omrim magbiin me'al hashulchan atzamos uklipin. Both say great case, right? You're eating your Shabbos meal, right? This is like a typical situation, like you're eating your Shabbos meal. So imagine you're eating your piece of chicken, you finish your chicken, and what? You left your bones. We'll say, what's the halachic status of bones? Muktzah. Now the truth is, interestingly enough, we saw in Smichas Chaver, not so pashut, it could depend on what, the presence of animals, right? Is there meat? Is there marrow? Okay, we're assuming right now that the bones we're talking about are muktzah. So magbir me ala shulchan atzamos uklipin. Right? Beis Shammai say that halacha l'maisa, you are permitted to go ahead and remove bones and shells from the table. Then I will say, by the way, what's the halacha? Why are you allowed to do that? Why are you allowed to do that? So Rashi says over here, Magbiyan, b'Shabbos me'ala shulchan atzamos, she'en ru'in la'achila, klipi agozim, v'lo chayshina l'muktzah. The truth is, we learned, why is that not a problem muktzah? And remember? Graf Shalrei, right? Excellent, right? And he did very well in the Bechina, by the way. I just want to point out how he did, right? Graf Shalrei, right? So again, I will say, so Graf Shalrei, right? It has the status of like garbage, right? And therefore, halacha l'maisa it's deemed offensive, and therefore, halacha l'maisa one can take it off the table. But again, we're not getting into that. Beis Hillel omrim misalek es hatab lakula uminara. Beis Hillel says you lift up the table. No, you can't handle the bones and the shells directly. You have to lift up the table in its entirety, and ultimately, pretty much, I will say, now to us that sounds like the imagery that we're thinking about this. Remember, they're eating at individual tables. So what Beis Hillel says is just lift up the table, take it to the kitchen, and dump it out in the garbage. That's called in halacha tiltul minat sad. Indirect movement of muktzah, which will not be problematic. Okay, so the Gemara says, Rav Nachman said, so once again, you have Beis Shammai being mekel, Beis Hillel being machmir. Rav Nachman said, I think the attribution is wrong. Anu ein lanu ela Beis Shammai k'Rabbi Yehuda, u Beis Hillel k'Rabbi Shimon. And now Rav Nachman comes along and says, by the way, I think you mixed up the attribution. And it's Beis Hillel who says that you could handle the bones and the shells directly, and Beis Shammai who says that you have to move the table. Why? Because Beis Shammai holds like Rabbi Yehuda, the stricter view of muktzah, and Beis Hillel holds like Rabbi Shimon. We'll say we now have Rav Nachman directly contradicting himself. Rav Nachman wanted to explain the Mishnah that, remember, it's a tarnagolas ha'omedes lagadol beitzim. It's a chicken that is designated to lay eggs. That's aleph, right? And the reason why Beis Shammai allows you to eat the egg, and it's not a problem of muktzah, is because Beis Shammai adopts a lenient approach to muktzah, i.e. Rabbi Shimon, and therefore halacha l'maisa allows you to go ahead and eat the egg. Now we just saw that Rav Nachman goes ahead and links Beis Shammai with who? With Rabbi Yehuda, who's the stricter view of muktzah. Rav Nachman just contradicted himself. Rav Nachman says, no, I'm not contradicting myself. Gabi Shabbos, Distam Lan Tana Kirabi Shimon. So now Rav Nachman is going to make an interesting distinction between Shabbos and Yom Tiv. So Rav Nachman will say like this: Gabi Shabbos, when it comes to Shabbos, Distam Lan Tana Kirabi Shimon. But so whenever you have a Stam Mishnah in Masechah Shabbos, we attribute it to Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara says this one, for example, Mechatchines hadaluin lifnei behema. So there's two different things over here. Daluin are gourds. So you're allowed to cut up the gourds in front of dogs on Shabbos. And both said, now what's the chiddush? Now we're talking about, remember, the gourds are detached from the ground. Why do I need a Gemara to tell me, a Mishnah to tell me that I'm allowed to cut up the gourds? Because remember, again, Rashi says over here, you might have thought, do the dogs need the gourd to be cut up in order to eat it? No. Does it make it easier for them to eat it if it's cut up? Yes. You might have thought that's called tircha yisera, unnecessary exertion on Shabbos, and therefore you're not allowed to do it. Rabbi Shimon says you are allowed to do it. You can cut up the gourds, and what else can you do? That's hanavel lifnei klavim. And you could also go ahead and cut up the carcass in front of the dogs as well. Now, what's the case of the carcass over here? The case of the carcass is where the animal died on Shabbos. Oh, an animal died on Shabbos. Well, let's talk about that for just a moment. We'll say, if an animal died on Shabbos, are you allowed to utilize this carcass for your dogs on Shabbos? Well, it depends. That's the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon. Right? According to Rabbi Yehuda, the answer will be no. Why not? Because once the animal was muktzah at the onset of Shabbos, ultimately, again, it remains muktzah for the duration, even if there's a change in the animal. According to Rabbi Shimon, no. Muktzah is reflective of the actual present state of the entity. So even though the animal was alive at the onset of Shabbos, and a live animal is muktzah, a dead animal is usable. I could feed it to my dogs, and therefore it's not muktzah. So remember again, so the Mishnah says, you could cut up the gourds, which is not really what's important for us. That's important to us. If an animal died on Shabbos, you could cut it up and feed it to your dogs. And therefore, again, the Gemara says, remember, now I want to point out, we just, Rav Nachman said, that in Shabbos, right, in Masechah Shabbos, a stam Mishnah, a Mishnah without attribution, reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon, which makes perfect sense. Right? Rabbi Shimon has a more permissive view of muktzah. Now I will say, we also like to establish a stam Mishnah like who? Umokim lo lebeis Hillel, Rabbi Shimon. And therefore, again, remember, we'd like the stam Mishnah ultimately, again, to go ahead and generally conform with Beis Hillel, because the general klal we have in halacha is who does the halacha follow? Beis Hillel. So there's two things happening over here. The halacha generally follows a stam Mishnah, and the halacha generally follows Beis Hillel. So therefore, again, in Shabbos, a stam Mishnah ultimately, again, is Rabbi Shimon, and we want the stam Mishnah also to reflect Beis Hillel. So therefore, when it comes to Shabbos, we align Beis Hillel with Rabbi Shimon. Therefore, again, Mokim lo Beis Hillel Rabbi Shimon. Aval Amadeis. Aval Gabe Yom Tiv. This stam lan Tanak Rabbi Yehuda. This is very interesting. When it comes to Yom Tif, however, stam Mishnah is usually reflective of the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. We'll discuss why there is this distinction between Shabbos and So also listen to this. So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says over here, this is actually a fascinating case. Look at Rashi. Ein mevakin eitzim biyamtiv lo min hakoros hasduros al gav zu al gav zu bekarka va'omdov sabinyan. But say, listen to this. If you go ahead and, let's say you have a stack of wood. Let's say you're building something, right? You're building something and you have a stack of wood. But yet on Yom Tiv, you need to go ahead and make a fire. You're allowed to make a fire on Yom Tiv. So you want to break up some wood in that construction pile to go ahead and use for your stove. Are you allowed to do that on Yom Tiv? So the Mishnah says no. Why not allowed to do that? Because that wood was designated for construction. So because it was designated for construction, right, it was set aside effectively for non-use. You cannot go ahead and take it for your own permitted use. Now both say, who's it, right? Similarly, if you have a barrel, and the barrel was whole and intact at the onset of Yom Tiv, and then what happened? It broke. So now you could go ahead and use the pieces of wood for your fire. The Mishnah says you're not allowed to. The Rabbi say, whose opinion does this reflect? Whose opinion does this reflect? Rabbi Huda, right? Because what's happening over here, essentially what we're saying is, since the item was muktzah at the onset of Yom Tiv, it retains that identity over the course of Yom Tiv, even though either you want to change the identity or just de facto the identity of the item has changed. That's Rabbi Huda. The Gemara says, Mokim lo lebeisel Rabbi Huda. So both say, this is absolutely amazing. Listen to what Rav Nachman is saying. Rav Nachman is saying, in general, attribution of a Stam Mishnah is different by Shabbos and Yom Tiv, right? So there's two things happening over here. There's who's a Stam Mishnah, and in general, the idea that the halacha follows Beis Hillel. A Stam, we'll say, remember, what's the power of a Stam Mishnah? We generally assume that whenever you have a Stam Mishnah, what does that mean? What does that mean? Everyone agrees. Everyone agrees. That's what it means. Because if there was somebody who disagreed, they would voice their opinion. Everyone agrees in a Stam Mishnah. And so we have that. And generally the halacha follows Beis Hillel. So watch what Rav Nachman does. This is incredible. So Rav Nachman says, when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos, Stam Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Shimon, who halacha l'maisa takes a moral, we'll call it permissive, approach to muktzah. And therefore, again, in Hilchos Shabbos, Beis Hillel is aligned with Rabbi Shimon. In Hilchos Yom Tiv, a Stam Mishnah usually reflects the view of Rabbi Yehuda, a stricter view of Muktzah, and therefore, halacha l'maisa, when it comes to Hilchos Yom Tiv, Beis Hillel will hold like Rabbi Yehuda. So the Gemara says, I don't understand this. So the Gemara is asking just like a framework question. Listen to this. Michti, man sasme lemas nisin. It will say, who decided that a Mishnah is a Stam Mishnah? Who decided that? Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So why is it Maishna b'Shabbos the Sasam Lan Rabbi Shimon or Maishna b'Yom Tiv the Sasam Lan Rabbi Yehuda? Why did Rabbi Yehuda Nasi decide that a Stam Mishnah by Shabbos should be reflective of Rabbi Shimon, more lenient view of Muktzah, and a Stam Mishnah by Yom Tiv should be reflective of Rabbi Yehuda, a stricter view of Muktzah? Why make that distinction? So listen to this. Amri, Shabbos de Chamira v'lo asi l'zalzulei bei Stam lan k'Rabbi Shimon de Mekel Yom Tiv de Kil v'asi l'zalzulei bei Stam lan k'Rabbi Yehuda de Machmir. So this is incredible. So Rav Nachman will explain, or the Gemara explains like this. Rabbi Yehuda said the following calculation. In general, people are machmir with Shabbos. Right? People understand the severity and the significance of observing Shabbos correctly. Therefore, again, Rebbe felt we could be makel with a detail of Shabbos, because being makel with one detail of Shabbos will not erode the general adherence and sanctity of the day. And therefore, Rebbe felt that in this particular nekuda of muktzah, one could be a bit more lenient and subscribe to the more permissive view of Rabbi Shimon. But Yom Tiv, which already has quote-unquote kulos, that was what I want to point out, Yom Tiv doesn't actually have kulos, right? It's just that Yom Tiv is a different halachic construct. So there's a lot of things you could already do on Yom Tiv that you can't do on a Shabbos. Rebbe apparently had the concern that if we are makel by muktzah when it comes to Yom Tiv, what could chas v'shalom happen? That could lead to a breakdown and a general erosion of sanctity. So that's why Rebbe decided, Stam Mishnah, the halacha will follow Rabbi Shimon by Shabbos and will follow Rabbi Yehuda by Yom Tiv. And again, what that does effectively is, it aligns Beis Hillel with two different approaches to muktzah by 2 different days. So by Shabbos, Beis Hillel will be aligned with Rabbi Shimon, a more permissive view of Muktzah. By Yom Tiv, ultimately again, they'll be aligned with Rabbi Yehuda, a more restrictive view of Muktzah. And therefore, again, Rav Nachman was not contradicting himself, right? Rav Nachman was not contradicting himself. So remember again, what I just want to point out. So let's go back. So now, but now keep this. We'll say now let's tie this all together. Remember, how do we get into this? Rav Nachman wanted to suggest. Remember, what type of chicken are we talking about? What are we chicken? What are we chicken? What type of chicken? Betarnagolas ha'omedis legadol beitzim. And for eggs, right? A chicken that is designated for laying eggs. How did Rav Nachman want to go ahead and explain the machlokes? Rav Nachman said like this: it's machlokes and muktzah. That's what it is. And don't separate out no lud from the rest of muktzah. No lud is part of muktzah. So therefore, again, the machlokes b'sham, what's this? It's very simple. The machlokes b'sham Beis Hillel is a machlokes in hilchos muktzah. Essentially, do you hold like Rabbi Shimon or do you hold like Rabbi Yehuda? Beis Hillel in hilchos Yom Tiv holds like who? Holds like who? Rabbi Yehuda. And therefore, Beis Hillel, a more restrictive view of muktzah, and therefore Beis Hillel will say that when the chicken lays the egg on Yom Tiv, the egg is muktzah. What type of muktzah? Okay, we'll call it noli, call it whatever. It doesn't matter. It's muktzah. Beis Shammai has a more relaxed view of muktzah. They hold like Rabbi Shimon, even by Yom Tiv, and therefore halacha l'maisa will hold that the egg is permitted for consumption. Beautiful. So it says the Gemara, let's analyze this. So okay, so now how are you establishing the Mishnah? You're setting up the Mishnah as a chicken that is set aside for laying eggs, umishum muktzah, and the machlokes, therefore, between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel is about muktzah. It's about muktzah. Well, watch this. Ihachi, if that's the case that the machlokes is about muktzah, ademifligi bebeitzah, lifligi betarnagoles. I don't understand. If this is about muktzah, then why are you making the machlokes egg-centric? Right? The machlokes actually isn't about the egg. It's the same machlokes about the chicken. Right? But say, think about this. Remember, if you have a chicken, this is good to know. If you have a chicken that's laying eggs, what don't you have in mind to do with it on Yom Tiv? Eat it. Right? Which means, I will say the following. Which means that according to Rabbi Yehuda, even if you change your mind about that chicken on Yom Tiv, right? Halacha l'maisa, it's muktzah, you can't eat it. Right? According to Rabbi Shimon, he would say if you change your mind about it, you can eat it. If that's the case, so if that's the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel, the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is a fundamental yesodistic machlokes in Hilchos Muktzah that is as old as the Gemara itself between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. Then why do we have to get into the egg? It's the same machlokus about the chicken. Beis Shammai would say, if you have a tarnagoles ha'omedis lagadol beitzim, a chicken that is set aside to lay eggs, Beis Shammai would say, and you decide, that looks good. You cannot go ahead and eat that chicken on Yom Tiv. Beis Hillel says, I'm sorry, just the opposite. Beis Shammai says you can, Beis Hillel says you can't. So don't make the machlokus about the egg, make the machlokus about the chicken. To which the Gemara says, you're right. Why do we frame it this way? Lohodi'acha kochan de Beis Shammai de benolad shari. Because ultimately, again, when we make it about the egg, because consumption of the egg is even a bigger chiddush. Why is consumption of the egg a bigger chiddush according to Beis Shammai? Because it's nolad. See, the chicken was in existence at the beginning of Yom Tiv, right? Or even, I should say, prior to Yom Tiv. The egg was not. So if you want to illustrate the permissiveness of Beis Shammai's position, it is much better illustrated with the permission, with the license to consume the egg than it is to consume the chicken. I bet I can say just the opposite. But I would tell you that again, I can say just the opposite. Let's talk about the chicken to show you the restrictive nature of Beis Hillel's position, right? That not only does Beis Hillel not allow you to eat the egg, but Beis Hillel doesn't even allow you to what? To eat the chicken. To which the Gemara says, "V'chitema koach de teira adif." Okay, so I will say generally we have a principle in halacha of koach de teira adif, right? It is always much easier to aser things than it is to permit things. So in general, when the Gemara wants to go ahead and express a chiddush, right? The Gemara would like to express the chiddush in terms of what a novel ruling that allows someone to permit something. So because Beis Shammai is the permitter and Beis Hillel is the prohibitor, therefore again we'd rather frame the case in a way that gives the greatest chiddush in the realm of heter, not the realm of iser. To which the Gemara says, even if we adopt that, why not do the following? V'niflog betarvaihu. Why not go ahead and make the machlokes both about the chicken and the egg and frame it as follows? Tarnagoles ha'omedes lagadol beitzim. If you have a chicken that is set aside to lay eggs, he ubeitzasa, both the chicken and the egg, Beis Shammai omrim tochal, ubeis Hillel omrim lo tochal. Beis Shammai says you could eat it. Beis Hillel says you can't eat it. In other words, we'll say, so why not? In other words, it doesn't have to be an either or. Why don't you just include both the chicken and the egg in the machlokes? Ella. So we'll say, so therefore, because this question is a good one. In other words, that remember, we'll say what's very important to understand is as follows. Because the Mishnah sets up the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel about the egg, what does that seem to indicate to us? What does it indicate to us? That the machlokes is egg-centric. It's about the egg. The problem with Rav Nachman's approach, as compelling as it was, Rav Nachman did an excellent job on this. This was a very compelling argument, right? So as compelling as that was, we're left with one simple question, which is, well, the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel is not egg-centric. It's about the chicken and the egg. And if that's really true, then why doesn't the Mishnah say that? Therefore comes along Rabbah. We'll say, here we go, this is very exciting. Rabbah. So Rabbah wants to suggest another approach to the machlokes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. Oh, We're switching gears. Okay, it's not a Tanagos of Mesagadol Beitzah. It's not a chicken that's meant to lay eggs, but rather, again, this is a consumption chicken. Right, this is a chicken that you eat. Watch this. Ubiyom tov shechalios achar hashabes askinon. And what's the case of the Mishnah? The case of the Mishnah is when Yom Tov falls out on Sunday. On Sunday. And now the chicken lays the egg on Sunday. So what's the problem? Umishum hachana. I will say the problem over here in the Mishnah ultimately, again, is a problem of hachana. Hachana means preparing. We'll see from Shabbos to Yom Tov, or from Yom Tov to, we'll call from Shabbos to Yom Tov. Mishum hachana. V'kasavar Rabba. So we'll say, watch this. Rabba is something very interesting. Kol Beitzah de misyal daha'idna me'esmol gamrala. Any egg that the chicken lays today was in fact fully formed inside of its mother yesterday. So in other words, when you have an egg when the chicken lays an egg on Sunday, that egg really completed its formation on Shabbos. On Shabbos. So we'll say, now what's the problem? So then, therefore, understand what's happening over here. Therefore, if you have a chicken that lays an egg on Sunday, that egg was quote unquote prepared when? On Shabbos. So you have an egg that was prepared on Shabbos and was laid on Sunday. So what's the problem? Here we go. The Rabbi Tamo said this is a fascinating segment. Rabbi goes according to his reason, because what does Rabbi say? And by the way, Rashi points out over here, we'll get to Rashi in just a moment. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Tamo, Damar Rabba, my dichsiv, v'haya bayom hashishi, v'hechinu es asher yaviu. What we'll say, this is by the man. Right, so the Torah is talking about over here the double portion of man, which will fall in the desert. So remember again, Vayyabayam will be on the 6th day on Friday. Vehechinu es asher yaviu, and they will go ahead and what? They will prepare everything on Friday that they need for Shabbos. So Rabbah says this creates a paradigm. What's the paradigm? Chol meichin l'Shabbos, v'chol meichin l'Yom Tov. Ultimately, again, weekday could prepare for Shabbos, and weekday could prepare for Yom Tov. Ve'ein Yom Tov meichin l'Shabbos. You cannot prepare on Yom Tov for Shabbos. We'll say, remember, one of the great sugyas we're going to get to in Beitzah is the sugya of Erev Tavshilin, which we'll get to. Ve'ein Shabbos meichin l'Yom Tov. And Shabbos cannot prepare for Yom Tov. Right? So we'll say, so remember, it's fasting. So Rabbi was doing a paradigm. V'hayo bayom hashishi ve'chinu es asher yaviu. Teaches us, weekday can prepare for Shabbos, weekday can prepare for Yom Tov, but Shabbos cannot prepare for Yom Tov, and Yom Tov cannot prepare for Shabbos. Which Rabbi will say ultimately means what? Which means what? Anything you're going to use on Yom Tov must be quote unquote prepared when? When? On the weekday beforehand. And if something is prepared for Yom Tov on Shabbos, that effectively becomes precluded from use. Therefore, says Rabbi, when the chicken, even though we're talking about a consumption chicken over here, not a chicken that's set aside for lay eggs, right? But ultimately, again, when the chicken lays the egg on Sunday, which is Yom Tov, ultimately that egg was quote unquote prepared on Shabbos. And you cannot benefit from something that was prepared on Shabbos on Yom Tov. Now take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Rashi says over here, the whole Beitzah, the Misyalda, take a quick look at that Rashi. V'afagav debidi shamayimhu. Now remember again, when we say that the egg was prepared, in other words, I didn't do anything with it, right? This is all happening by HaKadosh Baruch Hu inside of the chicken. Nevertheless, Rashi says over here, it's aser. Deba'inon kol seudos Shabbos or seudos Yom Tov shemizumanos umuchanos miba'od yom shel chol. But essentially what Rabbah says is like this. Anything that you're going to use over Shabbos and Yom Tov must be actively prepared from before, we'll call it Yom Tov, from before Yom Tov. Now again, remember, you're allowed to cook on Yom Tov, even Rabbah agrees with that, but he means anything that you're going to use has to be in existence before the onset of Yom Tov. If it's not in existence before the onset of Yom Tov, it's not quote-unquote prepared. And therefore, in this case, we're going from Shabbos to Yom Tov. The egg was not prepared before Yom Tov. Actually, the preparation took place on Shabbos, going into Yom Tov, and halacha l'maaseh, that is problematic. Look at Rashi, one more Rashi. Ve'echinu, Rashi says, ve'hezminu, kigon mikan ani ochel l'machar. Rabbah literally says that a person has to be able to say, on Erev Yom Tov, here is where I'm eating from tomorrow. Now, whether or not you need an actual designation, Rabbah is just saying, whatever you're going to partake of on Yom Tov, ultimately must be in existence and must be prepared before Yom Tiv. Again, Rashi just goes on to say, halacha l'maisi, you don't actually need the food to be prepared. So both say, so therefore again, so what's happening over here is as follows. Rabba's introducing to us a brand new idea, which is that, no, this is not a chicken that's meant to lay eggs, because that would be obvious. If it's a chicken that, see, according to Rabba's approach, if it's a chicken that's meant to lay eggs, both say, everyone will agree that what? Will agree that what? That it's going to be muktzah. It's going to muktzah al no lod, right? It's not going to work. Rabba wants to suggest it's actually a consumption chicken. If it's a consumption chicken, then what's the problem? It's a problem of hachana. In order to partake of something on Yom Tiv, it must be prepared from the weekday to be able to use it. In this case, the egg is quote unquote prepared on Shabbos for Yom Tiv, and ultimately, again, that is going to be us. Rabbi say, I'll just end off. We'll stop over here for today, but I'll just end off. I'm leaving in the middle of Rabbah. What an incredible Musar Haskil. See, Rabbi say, what the Gemara is teaching us is something incredible. If you want Shabbos, if you want Yom Tiv, right, you want Kedusha in your life, Kedusha always requires hachana, always requires preparation, right? If you have to be mechin b'chol, l'tzorech Shabbos, or l'tzorech Yom Tiv, which I will say such an incredible yesod, because sometimes we show up at quote-unquote religious events, right? We show up at spiritual moments and we expect to be inspired right there. It doesn't work that way. If you want inspiration, if you want devekus, if you want to feel a connection to the Ribono Shel Olam, the only way to have a Shabbos, what's Shabbos? What's Shabbos? Shabbos is me'ein olam haba. Shabbos is dwelling with the Ribono Shel Olam. If you want a Shabbos, you require hachana b'chol. There has to be proper weekday preparation. You want Yom Tiv. You want to be Ola Regel, not yet physically, but spiritually. It requires Hachana B'chol. And you can't be Mechin from Shabbos to Yom Tiv, from Yom Tiv to Shabbos. You can't do the Hachana once you're embedded in the Kedusha itself. But the Hachana really takes place B'chana. I will say, this is so incredibly important. This is why the Mishnah Bracha says, the Chasidim HaRishonim were Shon Sha'achas of Tefillah. The original Chasidim used to go ahead and whatever Shon means, meditate, prepare for an hour, or it doesn't have to mean an hour, for some amount of time before Tefillah. Why? You want to have it's everything. You want to have a meaningful davening experience. It's so difficult for us. It requires preparation. Whatever meaningful event you want in life requires hachana. Chol mechin l'Shabbos, chol mechin. And the Sasema says that this will really stop. Sasema says that's how you know the holiest days of the year quotes the Zohar, which is actually incredible. Holiest days of the year are the days between Yom Kippur and Sukkot. Between Yom Kippur and Sukkot, it's been as manim, right? What's between Yom Kippur and Sukkot? Right? Because what are you doing between Yom Kippur and Sukkot? There's such a frenzied hachana, right? If you think about it, there's no specific mitzvahs between Yom Kippur and Sukkot, but I'm busy. I'm this hachana, lulav and esrog, sukkah, Yom Tiv, this hachanas like no other time. Says this Svasemes, hachanas, preparation for Kedusha, putting yourself in the right headspace, going ahead and making sure that the framework of your life is ready to makabel that Kedusha. Sometimes the hachana is even more powerful and impactful than the davar shebekdusha itself. Chol mechin l'Yom Tiv, chol mechin l'Shabbos. So we'll stop over here. We'll pick up with Rabbi Mir Hashem tomorrow.
Sibling who's not observant, but they always say, I don't have to be observant.